Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this first EPC update of the autumn season, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki Davis, I'm a senior advisor to the EPC, and with me this week, as always, delighted to welcome Janis Emmanouilidis, Director of Studies at the EPC, and Chief Executive Fabian Zuleeg. Very good afternoon to you both, gentlemen. And in this special edition of Update, we're going to be discussing the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's State of the Union speech this morning. What did she say? What does it mean for the EU agenda over the next 12 months? And is the Commission charting the best possible way forward at this watershed moment? That was the question we posed in the title of this event. As always, totally interactive session, questions from me, and then I hope also from all of you. Your microphones are muted, but if you want to take the floor and you want to speak, please do click on the raised hands button and I will open your mic and allow you to speak when the time comes. If you prefer to write your question, just click on the Q&A button, not the chat, the Q&A, and please be as brief as possible. So let's start, before we delve into some of the detail of the speech, with an overall assessment of what was it that Ursula von der Leyen really wanted us to take away from her speech this year, and how did both Janis and Fabian assess the overall tone, the content? Fabian, for you, what did you identify as her key message? And for you, was it the right one?
I think we have to start with recognizing that there was a lot of pressure on her to get it right, get the tone right. Because clearly this is in the middle of a Zeitenwende, a watershed moment, where a lot is being asked of the European Union. And overall, I think she got the tone right. Yes, there are a lot of questions we can ask about some of the detailed proposals, or whether there are proposals behind some of the announcements. But overall, I think she had to make very clear that it was essentially unconditional support of Ukraine, and that we would go the whole way. She had to make clear that there was a plan to deal with energy, to deal with the cost of living crisis, which we're seeing. And she also had to, I think, and that was something which I felt she did rather well, is she also had to have elements of hope in there about how can we actually make things work better. There were also some tricky issues carrying over from previous years, which I'm sure we get into, the rule of law question clearly still being there. But overall, I think it was a good speech. I think the key question is actually, and in that sense, it's not really about the speech. The key question is, are we going to see that this really then gets translated into policy, into action? And that will crucially depend on the capitals rather than on what happens here in Brussels.
And you pointed in some areas where you said questions about the detailed proposals, or you added, even if there are proposals behind some of the headlines, in some areas, I don't know whether your assessment, whether it was a little thin on content in some areas, but Janis, your overall assessment of both the tone and the substance.
Well, first of all, Fabian is right. This was an important speech, given that we're living under very difficult, but also very different circumstances to where we were a year or 2 years ago. But let's not also forget it was her third State of the Union speech. She will have the last one of her first 5 years. She hopes to have probably more than one set of 5 years. So next year. So that's also important for her personally to prepare for what comes at that moment in time. If you look into the speech, I think it's not that surprising because there was pathos in the speech. There was also pathos directed towards Ukrainians, which I think was the right thing to do under the current circumstances. Otherwise, in terms of content, I think it was a long list, long to-do list, which she mentioned, also many things which she announced, where the question is whether they will fly at the end of the day, what the details will look like. We will discuss all that. I felt that what I was lagging was one that I think she could have also discussed more about the longer term challenges which we have. Now, she shouldn't have concentrated on that, but I think she was very much focusing on today and tomorrow. But if we are living in a Zeitenwende moment, if we've experienced a watershed, there is the longer term reflection which need to be shared. And I don't only mean, we'll talk about it, I'm sure, the need for a convention, which some were surprised that she mentioned that, but that she also becomes more specific in terms of what are the challenges, the longer term challenges we have in front of us. And the last point, she was sending out, and it makes sense, a strong signal of unity. I.e. that we have been able to deal with what has happened on the 24th of February in a decisive and also fast manner. But there are changes to where we were 6 or 7 months ago in terms of the degree of unity among member states. And I think that also, if one wants to look forward to the upcoming period, is something to deserve mentioning. And it's not about, undermining unity by saying that we are having issues among the 27. It is about keeping up to the level of unity which we require by acknowledging that we're having issues with respect to sticking together. And there I found being also more critical also of member states was something which was somewhat missing.
Indeed, she ended her speech by talking about a union that stands together, a union that prevails by working together, by being united. Question, will that unity hold? And if it won't, what does the EU do? How does it cope with a certain element of disunity? Things to come back to. You talked about discussing the longer term, and indeed, you mentioned the convention. She talked about preparing for the world of tomorrow. Fabian, I was quite struck. She did talk about issues relating to economic growth, to the Green Deal, to digital, but there was not, as I saw it, much of an attempt to address head on the question of whether there is now attention for EU leaders, that they're going to, i.e. a rationale and a strong argument for saying we need to still continue that transformation despite everything else we face. Did you feel that was missing from the speech? Was it necessary to say at all? Because there's been a lot of speculation that the commitment to the Green Deal, to the digital transformation will subside, given how much EU leaders have got on their plate. Did she need to make that clearer, or do you think it's self-evident?
I mean, I think there are some references to that in the speech. So it's not that she didn't mention it. Yes, you could have emphasized it more. But actually, I think in some ways, it's a clever way of packaging this, that you're actually not necessarily just emphasizing these as objectives in their own right, but you're also talking about how much they contribute to some of the other objectives you have. And in a sense, I think that is a political realism, to recognize that in the current pressure we are feeling, there is going to be a limit to what governments will be willing to do. So, for example, talking about a huge investment in hydrogen, clearly what is in the background there is not only dealing with the immediate pressures, it is about the transformation of the economy as a whole, but it is packaged within that overall we currently are going through a moment where these things will have to be done, and they will have to be done because the end point of all of this is the decoupling from Russia. That will have to be addressed, and at the same time, we can also achieve the objectives we have in other areas.
Thank you very much. Let's begin to delve into some of the detail, and I think we have to start with where she started, the energy issue. She did enumerate, and maybe I can stay, actually, Janis, let me come to you first on this. In terms of what she was proposing, and some of this, of course, already being discussed. We had a meeting of the energy ministers last Friday. Can you just outline for us what she put on the table? What, if any of that, was absolutely new, or was it all things we already knew about? And perhaps then get a sense from both of you of the politics of this. Is this likely to fly?
No, there's nothing new which came out of it. There are two things which were explicitly mentioned, which is measures for member states to reduce electric consumption. That's the Commission will come forward with concrete measures. She didn't indicate what exactly that would mean. And she mentioned, and again, this is not new because this has already been in the debate and we knew about it, the need for a cap on revenues of companies that produce electricity, and that would lead to 140 billion, which then has to be used in order to counter the negative effects of the increase in electricity prices. She mentioned, by the way, the most thorny issue which member states cannot agree on, which is the price cap. Yeah. Because at some point she said that that all the things which are being discussed are emergency and temporary measures which we're working on, and then she said including our discussion on price caps. So what she was saying is we're still working on it. We're trying to find a compromise, but we know how difficult that is. And we also know how old this discussion is. This is not something which is being discussed over the past weeks. It's being discussed over the past months. There are ideas which have been out there in terms of capping the price in a more concrete way, coming from particular member states, including Spain, Greece, and others, which are being opposed by other member states. And what she was indicating, I know we have this discussion, we're not there yet, but we're still working on it to find a compromise. But in terms of new initiatives, we didn't see anything which was particularly new. It was rather repeating what we knew, by the way.
And politically, Fabian, will it fly? I mean, as she said, they're still discussing the cap. Will it fly? What is the sense among member states now?
I think we don't know yet. And maybe this is also too early to answer that question completely, because I think in the end, a lot of what is happening now, we should be seeing as preparation for autumn and winter, when some of the measures will have to come into place, and where also some of the more difficult decisions will have to be taken. There are some things which are being done now, which have to do with dealing with price levels. Interesting to also note that at the moment we have seen a reduction in gas price, quite a significant one. So there's a lot of volatility in the market as well. But the real question, I think, is going to come in winter, when we simply will not have sufficient supply. And that's not going to be fixed with a price cap. We will have to take a lot of different measures at that point in time. And I think what we're seeing now is really the preparation of the ground to say these are things which we might have to have in our arsenal as we're going forward. And I would suspect that member states will become much more willing to do some of these things when things really start to bite.
Mm-hmm. Janis, what's your assessment of the politics of this?
Yeah, just in addition to what Fabian said, because I think that making that remark and indicating that we're still working on the price cap was politically smart, because actually as pressure will be increasing, the pressure will also be increasing in those countries who have been fighting against installing some sort of a price cap. So you get to the moment where it will be public opinion in these countries pushing for the need to do something which is more decisive, and that I think will lead at the end of the day to a more concrete discussion at the European level and the readiness of those governments which up till now have been hesitant to agree to some form of a price cap, where again, the question is what that would look like in concrete terms. So politically, from her perspective, I think it was wise to put it that way, the way she put it, in order to prepare the ground, as Fabian was saying.
Thank you. A question from Cody Tippy in our audience. I don't know whether you can answer. Cody asks, what alternatives are being implemented from shifts of 40% to 9% gas purchase and exchange? She referred to the fact that there'd been this dramatic fall in Russia's share of our gas imports. And Cody asks, are such reserves simply being pulled from other trading partners or being redirected into other energy initiatives, solar, water, wind, hydrogen? As you mentioned earlier, Fabian, the European Hydrogen Bank, one of the proposals she was talking about. Do we get more of a sense of where this is going? Fabian?
I think, and I don't have the specific figures because, of course, this is national. It's not we have an overall figure, which is the average for the European Union. But what is being done in the different countries depends on the national environment and what capacities there are. And I think what we are seeing at the moment is that countries are using everything they can bring online quickly. But the difficulty is always that you have to have the capacities. Yes, if you have some spare capacity, you will use that spare capacity. But if you don't, then it has to come down to reductions in usage. And that, I think, is also playing a role. I think people, also individuals, have actually reduced their usage of gas, given the prices as well. But I think, frankly, the real question is not now, because we are in summer. So the overall usage is going to be much lower than we have during winter. And it means that by and large, we have spare energy capacities during the month when we don't have that much demand. In winter, we don't have spare capacities. So that's really when the question is going to arise: what do we do if we have actual supply shortfalls?
And an interesting question, I'm not sure it's one necessarily for you to pick up on, but it also was raised by an MEP this morning, and someone who remains nameless in our audience says, as a measure for households and business to reduce their consumption of electricity, wouldn't it be the right moment to stop the shift of winter versus summertime? A perennial European debate, as I say, mentioned by an MEP this morning. I'll leave that one floating out there because we've got a lot of ground to cover. Just in terms of staying with the economy for a moment, and then I'd like to come on to Russia. But in terms of driving the green and digital transition and the economy at this difficult time, Ursula von der Leyen highlighted 3 areas that she said were key. 1, enabling the business environment. 2, having the workforce with the right skills. And 3, the issue of access to raw materials for industry. Were these the right priorities, do you think? Is there anything missing? Let me first, as the EPC's chief economist, come to you on that one, Fabian. Are they the right priorities? Is anything missing from that list, do you think?
I think those priorities they encompass a large range of different things. And clearly, what we've just been discussing around energy is a critical component of all of those questions as well. I do think that this question of supply of critical raw materials, but also critical technologies, I don't think we should forget that element of it, is extremely important. That's why I think it's also interesting to see this reference to some kind of European sovereign fund. Well, this is one of the areas where we don't actually have any detail of what that means, what it would look like, how big it would be, when it would come, because it's just as something which happens in future at some point. But I think this kind of question of how do we actually invest into the critical technologies of the future, not just renewables. I mean, that's of course very important, not just hydrogen, but actually key enabling technologies which are needed for our economies in future, because these will determine how we can deal with these kind of challenges. I think overall, yes, it is there. I think on some areas it could be more concrete, it could be more directed. But I also have a rather big worry when it comes particularly to the bit about labor markets training, the European Year of Skills. And that is the perennial question we always have when it comes to these questions at the European level, is what kind of competences do we have at the European level to deal with this? Is there going to be some form of shift, or is this language but not delivery?
Indeed, and there was a reference when she talked about skills. The only concrete measure I heard was suggesting that 2023 should be the European Year of Education and Training. Whether that symbolism matters, whether it makes a difference, question mark. But Janis, your assessment in that area.
Well, first of all, I think if you take that last example, the European Year of Skills, last year was the European Year of the Youth, which was announced, without it having concrete elements linked to it. They had to be filled as the year then started in 22. And I think it's the same now here with respect to the European Year of the Skills. It sounds good, but at the end of the day, what actually will be implemented? And if you look into the list of all the measures which were mentioned in terms of the economic reaction to the current crisis, which by the way also made a reference to Next Generation EU, saying that we still have 700 billion which still have to flow, a reference to the need to reform economic governance in the European Union, which also plays a part, the SME relief package, a revision of the late payment directive. All these things were mentioned, plus all the other things which you have already referred to in the speech. But at the end of the day, we know that what is the ability of the European economies, national economies to react is limited by the competence structures of the European Union. We're not talking about something which would go beyond Next Generation EU. So it's not trying to counter, as we did, to the negative economic effects of the COVID-19 crisis. So we're talking about doing more of what we have already started doing, linking it to the new realities. That makes sense, don't get me wrong, but actually it will depend on many other factors which are not being determined at the European level, and let alone by the fact that the country which is extremely significant for Europe, for Europe's economy, and which will be enormously hit by the current situation and because of its dependency it has on Russian gas, is Germany. So that will largely also determine as to how Europe will be able to deal economically with this crisis, and will depend on what measures are being taken at the national level, especially in Germany. So I think what we've heard today actually will not be decisive in terms to counter the negative economic effects of the crisis, especially as we move into winter.
Before we come on to Russia, yes, sorry, Fabian.
Just to add one point, because I think it's also interesting to see that she announced a new approach to economic governance, and in particular,
exactly. What does it mean? She talked about flexibility, more accountability. What are we likely to see when those proposals come, Fabian? Do we know?
Well, I think this is the Goldilocks dream we have had at the European level, the right balance between accountability, responsibility, and solidarity. So the question here is really that we know that the current rules for the foreseeable future aren't going to function the way they have functioned up to now. We've had the suspension of the excessive deficit procedure, the suspension of sanctions, because we know that governments cannot make ends meet unless they can borrow, unless they run up more debt. So this is about really saying, how do we package that reality into something which then can still work at the European level? So we do want to have some of the investments I was referring to. So what we don't want is essentially a return to the harsh austerity which we've had in some countries, which have led to underinvestment, apart from the social and economic costs which are associated with it. But at the same time, we don't want countries to go completely in the wrong direction. So I think as a signal, that is the right signal to set. Yes, we need reform, we need to address it, but we also have to recognize that in the end, this is a debate between member states. It's about how far some member states are willing to go and how far other member states are going to push. And there we've had, for example, the German finance minister saying rather cautious things, if I'm being very nice, about some of these reforms. So we have to see actually how much of this is politically feasible. But the need for reform is clear.
Yeah, Just van Ursel from the audience says, the president did not mention the internal market, and we're experiencing a panoply of national subvention programs in member states, which are necessarily mutually competing, says Just. Isn't it a very important question how long and to what extent these national programs are acceptable in view of equal economic conditions across the union? How long, he asks, can the union afford such divisive national policies? Quick reaction on that, Fabian, and then I do want to move on to Russia, and I'll come to Janis first on that. Fabian.
Just, he did mention the single market, but not in that context. He referred to it in the context of Ukraine. So you might find that ironic that he emphasized how, she emphasized how important it is within the context of enlargement to Ukraine. But I think, yes, there is a gap there. It wasn't really mentioned. Clearly, I mean, some of the measures which are there, for example, easing the way business can run their affairs, are single market measures, but the recognition of the single market as a driver of the European economy wasn't really there. And in particular, what wasn't there is this recognition of the issue of subsidies and in how far we are seeing a fragmentation of the single market because of that. This is a danger we've warned about before in the context of COVID. It continues to be there. I think the danger in some ways has gotten even bigger now because of the severity of the situation. But for the moment, I don't see that there's a real wish at the European level to address it, and particularly not by the member states, because the question always has to be, what is the answer? And the answer cannot be that we simply go back to the competition rules which were there in a very different environment. So the answer has to be that some of these things we should be doing together at the European level rather than doing them at the national level. And if that is the case, you need a completely different industrial policy at the European level with real money behind it. And that member states aren't willing to do.
Hence steering away from it. Yeah, it's a reaction on that, and then we'll move to Russia.
Just to add to the response which Fabian just gave, I think we're in a totally different situation if you compare it to 2020 during the COVID-19 crisis. Because at the time we had a discussion, as you remember, in the early months of 2020 about how the level playing field is being undermined by the fact that it was especially one country, Germany, being able to support its economy in a way which no other one was able to support, which by the way then was also a political reason which led to the agreement between Paris and Berlin, which eventually led to the next generation EU agreement. But now we're under a totally different situation. We have a situation in Germany which is bleaker than it was, in 2020 in relative terms compared to other member states. There is much more of an attitude of member states need to do this on their own. Plus, let's not forget, we have this is the argument. We have next generation, which we still need to spend the money on. So we already have at the European level an instrument which you can use. We don't need to put something in place which is in order to counter these imbalances which are potentially created because member states being able to support their economies better than other member states. And so we're operating in a totally different environment, and the logic which is also politically being displayed is a different logic than what we had in 2020. Just one remark with respect to economic governance reform. I'll be very short. This is a typical example of where we find ourselves in a situation where the question comes up as to whether the things which we already have in the drawer will be implemented. So whatever von der Leyen mentioned today in her speech, more flexibility on the debt reduction path, more accountability on delivery, and simpler rules. These are things which have been in the drawers for a long time. So the question is whether the political atmosphere now is conducive to doing the things which we have been discussing for a long time, which also had been discussed within the context of the Eurogroup. And I still have my doubts that we will do what is necessary. Also, if you see, Fabian was referring to the German finance minister, but also in other member states where we have debates also within member states of how we deal with the situation. So the differences among the 27 are not getting much smaller than they were in the past.
Okay, let's turn to Russia, and she devoted a considerable part of her speech to the war in Ukraine. We had, of course, the President Zelensky's wife was present in the chamber, and a lot of references to the Ukrainian people, their struggle, and the European Union support. And she said, European solidarity with Ukraine remains unshakable. And later she said, the sanctions are here to stay. This is the time for resolve and not for appeasement. Was that a message directed at member states who she fears are beginning to waver? We already know that one member state in particular throws smaller spanners in the works from time to time. What was your reading of the message she was trying to send when it comes to Russia, when it comes to support for Ukraine, not just now and in military terms and so on, but she also talked about being in it for the long haul. Janis, how did you read what she had to say, and does it reflect concerns that that unity might be cracking?
Well, first of all, I think that it was the right thing for her to send these signals, to say that our solidarity is unshakable, as you already quoted, that we will stick to the sanctions as they stand. However, having said that, we know that there are questions related to these points. There are questions in some member states as to whether there is actually total unity among the EU 27 when it comes to solidarity. How much are we actually willing to support Ukraine? Look at the discussion which we're having now, also with respect to weapons delivery following the successes of the Ukraine army over the past weeks. And we also have discussions as to whether will we really stick to the sanctions forever, or will we also use them in order to strike a deal with Moscow? That's what some are asking themselves. These are some of the elements, some of the fundamental questions where there are differences among the EU 27. And by saying what she said, she gave a signal of, these are my positions. I think we should not in any way undermine solidarity. We should not question sanctions. And all those who are doing that are on the wrong track. And by the way, also in her speech, she was saying that we should have listened to those who know Putin better in Russia, in the countries neighboring Russia, but also in Poland, in the Baltic states, in general in the Central and Eastern European countries. So she was sending a signal to all those, we need to listen to you. And that was a strong signal towards these countries. We should have listened to you in the past. We should now listen to you now. And it was also a signal to those who have different opinions than these countries. So I think she was sending signals in both directions. The problem is that we have substantial differences between member states on these core questions, and these are undermining unity today. They're having a negative effect on today's unity, and that is something which she didn't spell out. And I think that was a tactical decision which she took, a political decision which she took. I think we need to have a more of an open debate about that, not in order to undermine unity, but in order to strengthen unity, and also to be more ambitious in terms of how we react to the Zeitenwende, to the watershed, which we haven't been up till now.
And indeed, Fabian, those divisions could deepen as the economic realities of what this war means for our economies. We've been talking about the energy situation, the cost of living crisis earlier, as that bites harder and harder as winter comes, as you were pointing to earlier on. Your reading of the message she was sending, and was it, I think I'm sort of inferring from what Janis said, there might have been a bit, methinks she protesteth too much, i.e. by saying, we are united, we are united, we are united, it reflected a deep concern that maybe we are not anymore as united as we were.
Well, clearly she was also firing a shot across the bow, particularly when you have the reference to sanctions. Very clearly it's saying to a particular member state, maybe a couple of member states who are wavering a bit, to say, no, these are going to stay. And if you are going to put it in question, there are going to be consequences. But I think the challenge Janis has already outlined is much more significant going forward. Because it's not only that we're going to have to maintain unity on what we have done so far, we also have to find unity to make decisions on a number of really tricky issues. How do we deal with them? Many of which have distributional consequences. So there will be this question of, are we showing enough solidarity? And it leads me even to the question to say, do we need to stop striving for unity in all areas? Because maybe there are some areas where, because we try to achieve unity, we are not ambitious enough, because we know that some countries aren't going to go as far as is going to be necessary. So maybe in some areas we have to also move beyond the European Union, do things in an intergovernmental way, where we can then exclude certain countries who are not ambitious enough to go forward. And hopefully that will then also have a longer term political effect. So I think, yes, unity is very important in those things we have done so far. But for the future, I think we should also create coalition of the willing who can go further, because in some areas there's still a long way to go.
In which areas are you thinking of particularly?
Well, I think they are so broad. Just referring back to the publication Janis and I did before the summer. I mean, you look, we identified 10 mega areas in which you have to make decisions. But clearly, we are going to have discussions around how do we achieve complete decoupling of energy from Russia? How do we then provide solidarity for those countries hardest hit? And do we want to have a system where we provide solidarity even to those countries which are not supporting the overall line? As we've seen with the debate around the sanctions, that one country can blackmail others into a particular situation because of the veto. On enlargement, we have to find a different way forward. When it comes to the reconstruction of Ukraine, how do we go forward? There are so many areas where we still have to make very critical and very difficult decisions.
Okay. Two big issues I want to come to, and one, China has just been raised by our audience. I want to talk about the Conference on the Future of Europe. Janis mentioned it. I want to talk about the rule of law, which I think Fabian mentioned. But John Palmer, you had a question, John. I have unmuted you. If you can unmute yourself as well, and go ahead, and please be as brief as you can. John.
Okay. Can you hear me?
We can hear you beautifully. Lovely to hear from you.
Lovely. My question is on top of the formidable problems that Fabian and Janis have outlined, which get bigger and bigger in scale. The Union is now committed to undertake on a separate track these discussions beginning in Prague with no less than 48 heads of state on a European political community. Now, I'm not expecting miracles to emerge out of this in the short run, but are there some areas unblocking bits, holding up some of the accession negotiations, thinking Bulgaria, Macedonia, maybe one or two others, that could emerge out of this immense project? And above all, where do you think it fits with the broader strategy of the Union towards the Ukraine war? Because it does seem to me to set up a very new and challenging framework.
Janis?
Well, that's a very difficult one. One, I think, if you look into how the European political community debate is developing, if you look and also listen carefully to what key politicians, policymakers are saying about it, it rather, from my perspective, moves in the direction of having a high-level dialogue among those participating, which, by the way, include not only countries who aspire to join the European Union, but also others like Liechtenstein, Norway, Switzerland. So it is a very heterogeneous club, but it's more about having a dialogue on issues which are pertinent, which are now significant in the context of the new era we live in, and to send a signal of we're not only united among the 27, we are also agree with major partners on how we need to deal with certain situations. But let's not be naive here. We also have, for example, Turkey in that group, where there are major differences between the EU member states and Ankara. But in general, where the European political community, I don't want to call it EPC because we are the EPC, how the political community is moving towards, I'm not seeing that it becomes an initiative which create more substance. There were some hopes, which some had, that it would lead to some form of staged accession, i.e. helping the countries who want to join to use that instrument in order to get there, but the composition in itself shows that this is not what it's about. So for me, it's more to have a dialogue. But then again, if we only have a periodic dialogue every once in a while, and in between, we don't actually progress in terms of also the issues we have differences on, what is it actually worthwhile for?
We will come back to that. We will come back to that in our next update, immediately after that informal summit in Prague, when we will talk about what they really did discuss and what it all means later on. Could I just ask, can we please keep the Q&A box for questions, not lots of comments, because I need to wade through and quickly, we've got a lot of ground to cover. I need to wade through quickly and see the questions. Just while we are talking external relations, I want very quickly on China, but then I want to come to the rule of law and to the Conference on the Future of Europe. Someone in our audience saying, views please on the ostensibly odd angle of approach on China. Bias, says the questioner, who is anonymous, bias Chinese funded research at a Dutch university, but no references to the UNHCR report on Jianxing, I'm never sure how to pronounce that, or to the much ballyhooed forced labor instrument. Is Ursula von der Leyen pulling her punches, and if so, why? Who can take that one up? Please.
I think she referred to this, and I think we need to see the context in which she refers to it. She referred to this as one of those examples where institutions being funded by other countries are undermining our democracy. And I think this was a warning shot to China, which is basically saying, don't interfere in our internal business. We will not tolerate that. And in that sense, it was rather strong. She did not go into the detail about the relationship with China, the human rights issue in China itself, but she was making a point about influence here. But I think this is an elephant in the room, and I can understand why she doesn't want to address that part of it, because in many ways, our dependence on China is much greater than our dependence was on Russia. It is much more systemic than it is with Russia, where it's essentially around raw materials and energy. And that raises a big question. If we no longer believe in interdependence as a way of controlling other countries' behavior, then how do we deal with relationships with countries where we have significant issues in that relationship? So I think the question of EU-China is going to be on the agenda inevitably. It will also depend on how China is seen in the context of Russia and the Ukraine war. Are they seen as broadly neutral? Are they seen as supportive? Are they even actively supportive of Russia? All of this will have an influence, but I think there's almost a feeling that we have so much on the table to deal with at the moment. Let's not add that unless we have to.
Let's come to one of those other issues that's on the table to deal with, the rule of law. A fairly brief reference, a firm reference, in the sense of, she said, it is our duty to protect the rule of law. We remain committed to judicial independence and to protecting the EU budget through the conditionality mechanism. It was a very short part of the speech, 2 sentences, maybe, Janis, but was it enough in terms of the firmness of message it sent?
No, it was not enough. I think that, she, as I said earlier, in many ways, the speech pushed the right buttons. So she pushed the right buttons. She mentioned the issues which are at stake, that democracy is at stake, that we need to make sure that judicial independence is being upheld. But she didn't become concrete. She didn't. There was one point where we said we will intensify our effort in terms of countering corruption in member states. But in terms of how do we going to deal now with, I don't know, the expression elephant in the elephants in the room is correct in this case because it's so evident. How do we deal with Poland? How with the Polish government? How do we deal with the Hungarian government? How firm are we? And this debate is ongoing. And also, if you witness how those who are dealing with these issues, rule of law, commented on the speech, most of those who are the main commentators and influence in the debate from that perspective did argue, yes, it was nice words, it was the right things that she tipped, but at the end of the day, it's not very concrete, and we still do not know whether the Commission will enhance its pressure, especially on the Hungarian government and the Polish government, or whether they will still play it the way they have played it over the past months, and also trying to, and we go back to a word which we've used here very often, trying to uphold unity. That is more important than undermining unity. So, but there was also, as Fabian was saying earlier, there were also signals which were sent, for example, in the Russia context to Budapest. So the speech included different elements, which I think relate to the problem which we're having now with individual government, especially with the governments in Budapest and in Warsaw.
Thank you very much. Did you want to add anything on that, Fabian, before we move on to the Conference on the Future of Europe?
No, I just think we should be aware of the linkage of all of this to the Conference on the Future of Europe and the Convention, in the sense that I think there's an increasing recognition that we have to move away from the situation where one country can simply block progress, and that this is the major issue we're facing in decision making, this explicit or implicit veto. So I think that drives quite a bit of thinking also behind the reforms which some people want to see.
Janis, let me turn to a subject very dear to your heart, the Conference on the Future of Europe. The EPC, of course, a driving force with others in the Conference Observatory that's been tracking the developments in the conference, commenting on them, inputting into the process. She did talk about it. She talked about why it mattered. She underlined, she said, now we need to deliver. The one concrete example she gave was about mental health. There was, in terms of recommendations that emerged. She also said citizens panels were here to stay, though precisely how we don't know. But the crucial thing, and you touched on it earlier, she did talk about her belief that we now need treaty reform, and she supported the European Parliament's call for a convention. How did you read what she says? Was there enough when she talked about delivery and then gave that example, for example, of mental health? Was that enough at this stage? Were you expecting more from the Commission about delivering on the things the citizens called for? And how were you surprised by the call for a convention or not?
Well, first of all, with respect to the two first issues you already mentioned, meaning that the Commission wants to install citizens panels as a regular feature in our democratic life, to quote her. And that refers especially to issues which relate to key legislative proposals. And the Commission is already working on that and wants to start doing this from next year onwards. So there's a concrete response which the Commission is giving to the need to enhance elements of deliberative democracy at the European level. She did not say as to what else should be done, which is also something where you need to have an agreement among all three institutions. So she was talking about what the Commission will be doing, which I think is fine. But on the other hand, I would also have wanted her to say more about, so what do we need to do as the three institutions together? And I'll come to the Convention in a second. The fact that she singled out an issue, I think, was perfectly sensible, because there is the question of, what will you actually implement out of the proposals which have come from the conference. So she picked up and said there will be an initiative on mental health. I don't think that was a surprise that they identified one area and said, this is what we will do in this area, but there are many more, because given that there are 49 proposals, more than 230 measures which came out of the Conference on the Future of Europe, the list of potential deliverables is much longer. With respect to treaty change, because she mentioned not only conventions, she also said that we need to enshrine solidarity between generations into our treaties. And I think that was interesting, because she said a very specific example of what needs to be done in terms of treaty change. And that, I think, is the avenue to take. Also, as we have discussed and also proposed in the Conference Observatory, that we don't talk about treaty change in a general sense, but about treaty changes in a concrete sense. And here she came up with one proposal of what needs to be changed, but there's much more. And probably enshrining solidarity between generations into the EU treaty is something where there will be more agreement compared to many of the other things which potentially would have to be changed about the treaties. And the fact that she mentioned the convention, I think, is interesting. It's also surprising. You could also see the reaction from MEPs, especially given the fact that the European Parliament has been the one asking for a convention for Article 48 procedure to change to have the ordinary revision procedure kicking off. So that was somewhat of a surprise, and also the European Parliament was caught by surprise. And it's interesting, but we all know at the end of the day, it's not the Commission calling the shots. And by the way, it was always the Commission arguing, we're not calling the shots. It's something which the member states and the European Parliament have to.
Why do you think she did it?
I think she's positioning herself. And I said at the beginning, it is 2022. It is her third speech, and she's preparing the ground which she needs to prepare in 23 much more for the EP elections in 24. She's sidelined with those who she thinks at the end will potentially prevail, or at least are the ones who she needs to support in order to get another 5 years. So I think there is also a tactical element. But again, it's not up to the Commission to make the decision on the convention. And then the question is, what would that convention be about? So the devil lies in the detail.
Absolutely. Fabian, a quick one on this. Then we have a question on Africa and the mentions of other parts of the world I'd like to come to briefly before we come back to a sort of overall assessment of where we go from here. But Fabian, on this issue of the conference.
I just wanted to note that when she calls for a convention, and this is not disagreeing with Janis, I think it's just a supplementary consideration. I think it's interesting that she says very explicitly, it is necessary to carry out reforms for enlargement. So if you follow the logic that we are going to enlarge, and that has become a geopolitical imperative, then it also means we are going to have to carry out significant reforms, because we cannot have the same decision-making procedures, etc., with a union of 30 plus, whatever it might be. So I think it's just interesting to keep that in mind. I mean, of course, she's perfectly right, but that's exactly where I was referring to one of these long-term decisions, which are incredibly politically tricky, because that means making decisions in many different areas which touch national interests very directly.
The question from our audience, an unnamed member of our audience, the word Africa was mentioned 3 times in the entire speech. Latin America once, the Indo-Pacific region not a single time. In times when the EU should be looking for strengthening its cooperation with like-minded partners, and she did indeed in another context talk about new partnerships around the world, does this send the right signal? Who would like to come in on that? Wave at me. Fabian.
I'll wave.
I'll pick a victim.
You were made to wave.
I think, firstly, I think it is difficult in a 1-hour speech to mention everything which matters. And in particular, I think there is also a real question about, do you actually have something to say? So are you only mentioning it to tick a box, or are you mentioning it because there is actually something on the work program of the Commission, on the policy program of the European Union? So I think this reflects a reality, but I think there is a big question, which is, what are we going to do with our neighborhood? And that, I think, one of the areas which wasn't mentioned in a great amount of detail was the food security crisis. We talked a lot about energy, but food security is clearly one of the areas which also needs to be addressed, also because of the political consequences that carries around the world. There are increasing signs that we are not having the support which we need, because we are not dealing with the consequences of this war.
Just want to come before we close to sort of an assessment of where the Commission is 3 years in. But an interesting question before I do that, very brief one, if you could, from each of you. Dimitri Korpakis says, do you think this kind of debate resonates with public opinion in the member states? How could we improve it? I've been struck. I remember the first State of the Union address, and this attempt there is now to whip up a great deal of make it like America, have the political focus on it, have the headlines and so on. Is that wise? Has it worked? Is there a better way of doing this? Or does it serve a purpose? Janis, I see you shaking your head.
No, I think that, first of all, I think it is good that we have the Commission President doing the State of the Union speech. I think it's a good thing, but we should not only also expect too much out of it. Fabian is right. It's one speech. You cannot put everything into it. At times, probably there's too much was being put into it, and the big message is getting undermined because of that. You will see. You saw it last year. You saw it the year before. There is not a strong reference in the media about on the speech, even in the country she knows best, which is her home country. Last year there was a small reference to the fact that she held the speech at the day last year. So I don't think that it will resonate strongly among the wider public, and it's not that citizens are waiting for that speech to be delivered. So let's not put the bar too high. But at the same time, I think it's good that we have these moments and times of reflection, and also to see what the leadership of the Commission has in mind and what she proposes. So it doesn't do any harm. It has an added value, but let's not go.
Don't over-egg it.
And ask
I want to squeeze in one more question from a raised hand in the audience from Heidi Misnitzer. I have opened your microphone, Heidi. If you can unmute yourself and give us your question as briefly as you can, please. Heidi, can you hear me? Heidi, are you there? Coming and going. Unfortunately, we're going to have to... No, it doesn't appear to be working. I just wanted to end by asking each of you for your assessment of this commission so far. You mentioned some of the speech was positioning for the next European elections, for the time when the decision comes on the next commission presidency. How would you assess the performance to date? And in terms of measuring the success or failure of what Ursula von der Leyen set out to do today, this is really unfair, but what keywords, and I'll allow you up to 3 of them, would you use to describe what needs to be done so that 12 months from now, she can come back and honestly and convincingly say to the Parliament, as she tried to do today, we are delivering, we have delivered on what I said last year. Fabian, how do you assess the team, and what would your 3 key words be for what needs to happen in the next year?
I'm not going to do that. But for a very specific reason, because I think we have to recognize the historic moment we're in. Yeah. This is the commission we have got, and there's an enormous program we have to deliver in the next year. So rather than getting into the detail of what has been done wrong in the past, what has been done right in the past, I think we all need to focus, and that includes very much the member states, onto making this work, because we don't have an option. And I'm not going to give you 3 keywords because I'm going to put it simpler. We have to win.
So putting everything behind Ukraine to make sure that we win that conflict, Ukraine emerges from this, and
everything behind the kind of reforms, the kind of changes we have to make internally to enable that to happen and to make it sustainable.
So don't just talk about a watershed moment, behave as if it is one. If I could encapsulate what you're saying. Janis, I don't know whether you're willing to take up my challenge.
Partially. First, you asked us to assess the team. And now this comes from a Brussels nerd. I'm aware of that. I'm saying that to those who also criticize us for being Brussels nerds. I struggle to see this commission as a team. I see that there are many divergencies within this group, within this college, major differences on certain positions, and we see a commission president which is showing leadership and showing that she's the president, but having problems in getting the team to be a team. The second point, and here I concur with what Fabian said, it is about the winter of discontent which we have in front of us, the difficult periods which are coming. And if in a year's time, we can be more confident about the fact that we're moving in the then winter of 23-24, we already should be happy with that outcome. So there's a lot which we have on the plate, a lot we have to deliver. And now comes the last point, which for me, and I referred to that already in the discussion, is in a year's time, I hope, and I'm not sure what will happen, but I hope that we will not only have dealt with the immediate concerns and have been able to come to the difficult period which is ahead of us, but also started a more fundamental discussion about what we still need to do. Mm-hmm. We have too much of a focus on what we need to do today and tomorrow, and it is already putting pressure on the EU27, but that will not be enough. And what I want us to avoid is that we find ourselves 3 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road saying we did not respond adequately to what happened on the 24th of February. And that, I think, is a leadership task which the entire EU has. So it's not only the leadership of the Commission, in this case, Ursula von der Leyen, it's more than her. But I hope that in a year's time, we will have made progress in that direction, although I'm not sure that we will have.
Thank you very much. And I wish we had more time to delve into some of the issues we've discussed in more detail and touch on more. But as with the speech, and you said it earlier, you can't include everything. Thank you so much for your questions and comments. I managed to get a lot of them in, but not all of them for the same reason. That is all we have time for this time. Just to flag up a few EPC activities. There was a publication last week on tackling the energy crisis. If you haven't seen it, do take a look. There's also going to be an EPC roundup. I'm not sure if it's published yet, but it is going to be a roundup of reactions to the speech, to some of the issues we've been talking about from various different EPC analysts. So watch out for that. Next week, there's an event on Tuesday on building a European health union, on Wednesday on strategic foresight, and on Thursday on the 2022 rule of law report. All that and much more. Look at the website for more details. And we, as I mentioned earlier, will be back with another update after the informal summit in Prague next month. So thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you, Fabian. Thank you, Janis, for a great discussion as always, and have a pleasant rest of the day. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.